Today is May the 13th, 2008, and I'm in the north section of Dallas. And I'm at the home today of Mr. and Miss Bill and Gail Newman, William Newman. And Mr. and Miss Newman are certainly one of the great parts of history, for on November the 22nd, 1963, on that Shattered Friday, they were standing on the north side of Elm Street on the sidewalk as President John Fitzgerald Kennedy was assassinated. And my partner here, Steve Allred, and I, we've interviewed many witnesses in the last 4 years that were in Dealey Plaza that day, but we've never had the opportunity or the gracefulness of interviewing Mr. and Miss Newman. Of course, they've done many interviews, and that was a very, very tragic day. And I'm sure they remember their accounts, and that's why we're doing the interview with them today, because this is going to be the 45th anniversary coming up. And a lot of the witnesses that were in Dealey Plaza that day, many of them have passed on, and some met mysterious, unaccounted, unexplained deaths. But Mr. and Miss Newman is still living, and Officer Hargis, and people like that are still living. And we're trying to get these people on tape interviews for the cause of history and the truth. So, Mr. and Miss Newman, at this point in time, I'm going to ask you your first question. When you all got down to the plaza that morning, I understand that you all had been out to the airport and saw the president first.
That's correct, Mike. We had.
And when you left Love Field, you all came on downtown.
That's correct. What happened at Love Field was that Gail and our oldest boy, Bill, who was 4 at the time,
yes,
did not get up to the fence to see the president and Mrs. Kennedy.
Yes.
My youngest son, Clayton, and I managed to get right up to the fence and saw the cars that went by. And as you know, the parade route had been published in the paper, and so we just jumped in our car and headed towards the intersection of Elm and Houston Street near the Triple Underpass to try to get ahead of the parade so we could get a good look at the president.
Yes, sir. Mr. and Ms. Newman, approximately how long had you all been standing there when the car turned the corner and started down Elm Street?
We had probably been there less than 5 minutes. Very short time. I can remember that we parked not behind the school book depository, but the building across the street, and we walked up to the intersection of Elm and Houston, and there was a large crowd of people. So we just walked down the curb on the north side of Elm towards the Triple Underpass and fell in beside the last 2 people who were along the edge of the curb, which was 2 women. And we had been standing there probably less than 5 minutes when you could hear the cheer of the crowd and could hear the parade coming down Main Street.
Yeah, the 2 women you mentioned, I don't know if you've ever met them. One of them name was Jean Newman.
That's coincidental, isn't it?
And she lives in Malakoff, Texas. In fact, we're going to interview her next week.
I see.
The other lady was Cheryl McKinnon, who worked for Channel 8 News, and she's still living. I don't know where Miss McKinnon lives now. She left Dallas, but she is still living. She had on the black coat and the sunglasses. She was to your left, Miss Newman, and I think Miss Jean Newman was standing pretty much close to y'all there by the lamppost.
Right.
Wasn't too far away. Well, as the president's car turned the corner, Mr. and Miss Newman, in your own words, tell me what happened, what you saw and heard.
Well, I can recall seeing the president's car turn onto Houston Street off of Main, make a right-hand turn, could travel that short block of distance and turn left onto Elm. Yes. Of course, the crowd was very excited, just as we were, to see the President of the United States. And as the car came towards us, he was out about the width of 1 lane, yes, from the curb lane. As he came towards us, the first 2 shots rang out. And it was a boom, boom, about like that. And what I thought at the time, Mike, was someone had thrown a couple of firecrackers beside the car. Yes, and I thought, you know, that's very poor taste for someone to do that. I recall seeing the president's arms come up, and I actually testified that he came up out of his seat, yes, which in reality, it was just probably the reaction to when the bullet hit him in the back and apparently came out somewhere in this location. They were 100 or so feet probably from us, but as the car got closer to us, I could see Governor Conley in the car and him more or less stretched out, and the blood on his shirt and his protruding eyes. And just about that time, the car passed in front of us, and about as close as I am to Steve, probably some 10, 12 or so feet out from us, the third shot rang out, and I can recall seeing the side of President Kennedy's head blow off.
Yes.
I could see a mass of white and then the blood and fragments, and I turned to Gail and said, "That's it, hit the ground."
Yes, sir.
We turned around and threw our kids back on the grass and covered them there. And I can remember looking back and, and seeing the car slow down or nearly come to a complete stop, and then accelerate and take off and go out of sight into the triple underpass.
Yes, sir.
I also recall Mike hearing Mrs. Kennedy holler, "Oh my God, no, they've shot Jack."
Yes, sir. And you heard her say that, you and Miss Newman.
Yes, and I can remember I thought she was trying to get out of the car. And as the Zapruder film shows, the Secret Service agent run up and push her back into the car. I found out years later what she actually did. She reached back there and picked up a piece of the president's skull, and
That she really did.
and gave it to him out at Parkland Hospital.
Yeah, and I understand that piece of skull is now in the medical archives of the FBI
Is it?
in Washington. That's what I've been told. I've never been there and seen it. That's what I've been told.
And we stayed on the ground probably a minute or so, maybe 2 minutes. And then when we got up, two men approached us. One of them was Jerry Haynes. He was known as Mr. Peppermint at that time. He was a local TV personality. And he came over towards us and another man with him and asked us what we saw. And we told him, and he said, "Would you folks go with us to WFAA?" And we said, "Sure." We started towards WFAA, and he stopped a car on the street. You think it was Main Street that he stopped the car on, or Commerce?
Close to Main Street.
Right. And
Close to Maine and Houston.
Yeah.
Houston.
and told this man, said, "These people saw the president, which witnessed the president being shot. Would you drive us to WFAA?" And the guy said, "Sure." Jump in, and we drove over as short distances,
Yes.
And at that time, the Julie Bonnell show was going on, a cooking show.
Yes.
And we watched a few minutes of that, and they waited for clearance to put us on the air. And while we were waiting, the report came in that President Kennedy had been shot through the back and he was still alive. And, we'd just seen the side of his head come off.
You didn't quite. You knew better than
No, that was, and actually, Mike, I think I was in a little bit of a state of shock. I mean, not that I couldn't handle myself, but I was somewhat confused. And then after our interview on the air, we were taken over to Sheriff Bill Decker's office,
Yes.
and Gail and I gave 2, if I'm not mistaken, of 16 affidavits that day.
Yes.
And
I've seen that one of the
and-
pictures that y'all in.
and they kept us there until 9 or 10 o'clock at night, I think. And
Yes.
and what they were actually doing, and then we were told what they were doing, they were reviewing, they being whoever, I don't know, the sheriff's office or the FBI, whoever it may.
Yeah, I
may
think
have
all three
been.
were involved: the Dallas Sheriff's Department,
And-
the FBI, and the Dallas Police.
They were reviewing these affidavits and held us there just in case there were discrepancies or they wanted to re-interview us.
Miss Newman, standing left to you, were standing on the left side of Mr. Newman, and you had one of your children close to you, I believe, holding on to you. Do you recall, of course, I know it happened very fast, when the headshots hit the president, did you see any debris fly back or go forward?
I just when his head exploded, you could just see the debris fly sort of up.
Straight up?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very true. And I'm glad you said that. I don't know if you and Mr. Newman have. Of course, I know you've been doing this for years from that day, and certainly standing where you were. You and Mr. Newman, and then the motorcycle officer, Mr. James Cheney, who was on the right side, y'all same side. Of course, Officer Hargis was on the left. I would say that y'all would certainly have to be the four closest witnesses that was close to the president. Like Mr. Newman said earlier, y'all were only 10 to 12 feet away, and you could have been much closer than that. And the reason I asked you the question about seeing something go out, Officer Hargis, and I have Officer Hargis on tape interview, he was splattered with the brain debris, and that's why I asked you, maybe did you see that? Of course, with what was happening, I guess you wasn't really paying attention to that.
Well, no, I didn't notice the police officer. Just sort of terrified in the moment. But I do recall seeing these bits.
Yes, ma'am.
Fly. I mean, they didn't fly backwards. What I remember is just
straight up. Yes. And Mr. and Ms. Newman, when the president was shot, and this, I know you all have been interviewed by many people, CBS and on down, and I remember the interviews you all did with Marcos and other people. I don't know if you've ever been asked this question, and maybe I'm going to ask it in a different way. When you heard what is, I consider the last shot or shots, I believe there were 2 shots simultaneously. Could have been just one. I really don't know to this day. I believe there were 2. But when the president was hit in the head, in your opinions, and both standing where you were, did that last shot come from your left side or your right side or behind you, in your opinions?
Well, Mike, that's the big question, isn't it?
And you and I talked about that before.
I always say that the headshot I thought came from behind, but it was the visual impact
Certainly.
Of seeing the impact, the wound, the explosion, and President Kennedy going across the car seat towards Mrs. Kennedy. And so most of the time when I say behind, people want to know behind to my left meaning the 6th floor, behind my right meaning the picket fence. And I always leave it just with behind because it was strictly, my focus was on the president, the car and the president. So, to actually say I know positively it came from behind, I don't. But I just know how he reacted. And so it was the visual impact that it had on me. And then you got to remember, I did not recognize the first 2 shots as even being gunfire.
Yes.
So I would rather not speculate left or right. I know I'd make 50% of the people happy, maybe,
Yes,
if I went one way or the other. But it was, I wished I could give you a more definitive answer. But it was the visual impact that it had on me as he went over towards Mrs. Kennedy.
I think the way you should have. Because, and the reason I asked you all that, Mr. and Ms. Newman, I'm sure you already know, I have talked to many researchers in the case. Robert Groden, Josiah Thompson, Mark Lane, Stuart Galana. The great researchers, and I say great researchers, people that's been doing this 30 years and longer.
Right.
And then, of course, the newer researchers of later years, and they said, well, Mr. and Ms. Newman said the shot came from the grass. One guy even says that he had talked to you all, and y'all told him that you turned in time to see the man running from the fence. And I told him, Mr. and Ms. Newman has never said that.
No, that's not correct.
In no interview.
No.
And he said, oh, yes, they did. And I said, oh, no, they didn't. I said, no, I know better than that. So that's why I asked that question, and I knew that you were going to answer that way because that's what you told Josiah Thompson in 1966, what you just told us. And Mr. Thompson, he was in the Dealey Plaza 2 years ago, and I discussed this with him. And he told me, he said, well, Mr. and Ms. Newman said they saw the impact of the president's head, and it came somewhere from behind. He said they never said that it came from the grassy knoll. They didn't say it come from the book because they were focusing on the president, and they were looking right at him. And it happened in some 6 or 7 seconds. So they didn't even have time, which would also make sense. You didn't have time to stand there and say, well, the shot come up there, the shot came here, as many other witnesses.
No, my focus was on the car the entire time.
Certainly.
Mike, when people interview us at the site, and they take our picture or they film us, I know which direction they're going with their theory,
Certainly.
because if they stand us in such a way that the picket fence is in the background, or they stand us in such a manner that the 6th floor is in the background.
Yeah, I know that, yeah.
And
Pictures y'all have been in.
so, we don't try to direct them how to take our picture.
There was one photographer there that day named Richard Botham. I don't know if you and Mr. Newman ever met him. Mr. Botham died in 1984. He was standing across the street along with Jim Hawkins, Ike Hawkins, Art Rickaby. They were all photographers, and they were standing close to Mary Mormon. And now, do you and Miss Newman remember seeing Mary Mormon and Gene Hill? Of course, Gene Hill had on the famous red raincoat that day.
I don't remember seeing her. Like I say, we'd been there such a short time. I do recall seeing Mr. Zapruder, the man standing up behind us with the camera. I remember that, seeing him and the lady that was with him back there. Yeah, I remember seeing them, and I recall seeing the men on the steps. I think there was 3 of them. But, to tell you actually how many were there, the reason I can tell you there was 3 because I've seen pictures of them. But I can remember somebody standing along that area. And and then the 2 ladies beside us.
Yes.
2 women beside us. But that's pretty well it.
Yes.
I mean, there was a crowd of people, but nobody stood out in my mind other than the man back there with the camera.
Well, where y'all had walked to and standing when the president was shot, you all were pretty much the last 2 people as far as the main crowd coming down the sidewalk.
Yeah.
Because, of course, Mr. Hudson and them would pass you all on the steps.
Yeah, we were the last people sort of
against the curb.
That's right. You really were. And, of course, standing directly behind you on the pedestal, you can see Mr. Zapruder in the films, the Knicks film, and the much more film. You can see that. Another question I'll ask you, Mr. Newman, when the president was shot, you didn't see the actual piece of skull that Miss Kennedy reached out and picked up? You never saw that. I interviewed Charles Brim some years earlier. Of course, he died in 1996, and I talked to Mr. Brim in 1990 at his home over in Carrollton, Texas. And he told me that he saw of course, he was standing on the left side of the street, across from you all. I don't know if you remember seeing him. He had on a white shirt, and he had his little boy with him, Joe.
I remember, I know who he is, from seeing pictures, but I don't recall him from that day.
And he said he actually saw the skull, and it was in his opinion it went to the left past him. And he was standing just to the left of Mary Mormon and Gene Hill. And the reason I asked you that, did you see Miss Mormon? I thought, she took the famous passing old picture.
Right.
And with her having the camera, I thought maybe you might have, of course, like you say, you were focusing on the car.
That's right.
Do you remember Governor Connolly being hit, or did you see him when his shoulder dropped?
No, I don't recall that. Like I say, when the first 2 shots were fired, I didn't recognize that anybody had been hit other than President Kennedy coming up like that.
Certainly.
And I actually kind of thought he was protecting his face or something at that time. And I didn't recognize Governor Connolly had been hit until they got closer to us, and I could see the blood on him and see the condition that he was in.
Just about 3 more minutes, we're in it. Mr. Newman, on that, when you all hit the ground, of course, your kids were covered over your kids, your 2 children. You were facing, at that point, Mr. Zapruder. And he jumped down off the pedestal. Did you all see that when he jumped down?
I didn't. I don't recall. I don't recall seeing that. I do recall seeing people run up the slope, and go up towards the railroad yard.
You remember some of the policemen running up there?
Mike, I kind of hate to say this because it's been disputed.
Well, I know you're telling the truth.
But what I'm telling the truth is I remember it.
Yes.
The truth is a difficult thing sometimes.
The truth is you remember what
but as I remember it, some men jumped off the car behind the president, one or two of them, and they had something like a Thompson submachine gun or something, a weapon like that, and they went up the slope.
Yes.
Now, if I'm crazy or whatever, but I do recall seeing that. But it was more than just this one or two people. But that's what caught my attention when I saw the weapon.
Well,
And
I'll ask you to stop right there because I want to tell you something. You know, you're not crazy. And the reason I asked you that today, I don't know if you've ever been told this. Miss Marion Chisholm is still living. She lives over in the Pleasant Grove section of Dallas today. And I don't know if you and Miss Newman recall seeing her. She's a black lady, and she was there with her husband, John Arthur Chisholm. They had their little 2 or 3-year-old son with them.
yeah,
They were standing by the man known as the Umbrella. Umbrella Man. They were standing right next to him. And what you just said, Mr. Newman, I just talked to Miss Chisholm 3 days ago. And Miss Chisholm has always been very reluctant to do an interview with anybody. She's never done an interview, and she's 70, I think she told me she's 76 now. You can see her in many of the photographs. But in the book, Pictures of the Pain, what you just described is in that book, those pictures. And those pictures were taken, some by Mr. Richard Boffin and some by Art Rickaby. And there is a man that appears to have he's definitely got a gun in his hand, there's no doubt. But many people say that didn't happen, and it did happen because Miss Chisholm says that one of those men that you're talking about actually, and I think he had passed you all, he tackled Mr. Chisholm because Mr. Chisholm was heading up the hill toward the fence. And he told Mr. Chisholm he was a Secret Service agent after he tackled him and he showed him his badge. And she talks about that to this very day. And these are some of the aftermath facts that happened that a lot of people don't know. And of course, people ask the question in references to people running to the grassy knoll, and that's why I asked you that. And you're certainly not saying that you saw shots come from the grass. No, you never said that. But everybody has over the years wondered why so many people begin to run toward the grassy knoll. I've got Officer Hargis on tape interview, and he talks about, of course, he's the man that coined the phrase. He said, I ran up the grassy knoll, and he did. You see that in the films. And he says, amazingly, when I got there, he said, I didn't see anything, Mike. He told Stephen that, and we have him on tape interview with that. And he initially, though, first thought the shot came from that, and that's why he ran up there with his pistol in his hand. He talks about seeing Officer Roscoe White and several other police officers come around the pergola, the white structure. They came from the backside. And my next question is, so at that point when you all were on the ground, you and Miss Newman, you all never went up on there?
We headed towards there, but we
Never got up there completely?
no, because Jerry Haynes walked up to us.
Certainly.
and we left, you know.
Scott Myers told me, he said, oh, Mr. and Miss Newman was interviewed there on the grass. And I said, no, they weren't. They never went up on the grass, you know, up on the pavilion where the bench was. And
No.
the 2 big trees.
No.
That's what I thought. And I wanted to clear that up. And
Well, Mike, I never saw anything wrong with the Secret Service man or whoever it was running up there. But after making that statement years ago and then being told that nobody left the parade, nobody left one of the cars and went up there,
someone, we don't know who
then
it was.
then I just stopped. If someone asked me, I'd answer the question, but I never volunteered.
Well, you and I had talked about that before, and you had told me this story, and then I talked to Miss Chisholm 5 times, and she always mentions that.
The other thing that I said way back there, you may recall, was that the car stopped. But when I say stopped, I only mean that, like you apply the brakes and then get off the brakes and take off. It was when I look back. But you know, in the Zapruder film, it never shows the car stopping.
Many people said that.
So, you know, if I say stop, then somebody interprets that the car stopped for 30 seconds or a minute or a long period of time. And then they make a lot out of that.
Yeah.
So somebody asked me the question, I volunteered, but I do think the car stopped momentarily. And when I say momentarily, I'm just talking about looking over and seeing the brake lights, and it hit and kind of rocked the car. And one of them had, you know, a 2-way radio or phone or something to their ear. and then they floorboarded it. You know, by the time the Secret Service got over and the agent got over in the car, the other Secret Service agent, they floorboarded and took off. So we're just talking about seconds.
Yeah.
Here, you
2
know.
seconds even, maybe, yes.
Yeah.
I know exactly
Yeah.
what you mean, Mr. Newman.
Okay.
And you know, I told you this before, I was born in 1955, an 8-year-old kid. Me and my aunt, Miss Hattie Mae Williams, and several of our neighbors, Miss Jeffy Spencer and Miss Millie Perkins, we'd all went down to see the president. We were standing up on the corner by the Daltex building.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we were much further away from where you and Miss Newman were. And of course, I recently met you. Well, I met you about 5 years ago, first time. And had never talked to you up till that time. Many witnesses that were there that day never met each other. Maybe 20 years later, during the anniversary, people going down on the November the 22nd.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, you and Miss Newman have always been kind of a standout of the witnesses because of where you were standing, and you've seen in all the photographs, most definitely. The last question I'm going to ask you, Mr. and Miss Newman, and this will be the last question. As your lives have went on to this point, and I hope it continues to go on many, many, many more years, and I'm sure they will. Like myself, I'm sure you may have had some health problems. I certainly have. Oh, one other thing I want to mention before I ask you the last question. Also in the motorcade that day, one of the 3 leading motorcycle officers, Stavis Ellis, he was your uncle, right?
My uncle, yes. Uh-huh.
Yeah, Steve and I went to his home. 2003, it was the year of the 40th anniversary, and we talked with him and had a long, long conversation. Boy, he loved to go back and remember things. And he knew a lot of history, I tell you.
Oh, yeah.
And he told us he joined the force in '46, and he was a sergeant at that day.
Mm-hmm.
And do you remember? Did you wave at him?
We
when
waved
passed?
at him, yeah.
He told
We
us
waved
that.
at him.
Mm-hmm.
And he told us later, we talked to him a couple of days later, that he was on the other side of the underpass
Yeah,
when
that's what he
when
said.
the shots were fired, and the thought ran through his head is, I hope he knew there were shots. And
Yeah, you heard him.
knew where we were standing. He just thought to himself, I sure hope those kids are okay. Of course, he called us all kids.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, he was a great gentleman.
yeah, he
talked
said
to him,
that at Parkland,
Yeah.
that Miss Kennedy had that chunk of skull in
Yeah,
it.
he saw it.
And she handed it to someone and said, you might need this,
Yes.
or something to that effect.
Yeah, that's exactly. In fact, the man that was driving Vice President Johnson's car, Herschel Jacks, he was a Texas State Trooper. He was driving the car that Johnson was riding in, and he said he was standing there just as Officer Ellis was, and he said Miss Kennedy walked up to Dr. Jenkins and told her, said, "Here's a piece of my husband's head. This may help." Something to that effect. They all saw that at Parkland. And the last question I wanted to ask you all, of course, as the shot hit the president in the head, you certainly were looking at that. But do you remember hearing what sounded like a shot hitting glass at any time?
I don't.
In those, you never did. And what I'm referring to, and I'm sure y'all have seen the pictures over the years, there's definitely one shot in the windshield, the front windshield of the limousine. There was definitely one, and possibly 2. And a lot of the witnesses said they heard that. And it was just about the time, and some of the witnesses said that the president said, "Oh my God, I'm hit." I don't know if you've ever heard that. And that's written in many books. In fact, Josiah Thompson's book, 6 Seconds in Dallas, is in there. And where he would have said that, he would have still been he hadn't got to y'all yet, so he wouldn't have heard that. But then Governor Connolly hollered, "Oh my God, they're going to kill us all." Did you,
I've heard that statement. I didn't hear.
you didn't hear it?
I didn't hear it that day. Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you, did you hear that? Because they said it was pretty loud. Miss Chisholm said that she remembered the governor saying that, and he had kind of turned to his right, and as if to look at the president. And then she said just maybe a second later, the head was called down by y'all at that time, or 2 seconds. And Mr. Brandt, he was standing there up from you all. He was standing pretty close to the umbrella man, the man with the umbrella. You don't recall seeing the man with the umbrella that day?
No.
Well, it's my understanding, I think he may have been one of the 16 affidavits. Is that
You look
pop?
at it. The man came forward in '78 when they had the House Select Science Committee. And did you all testify at that committee?
No.
I didn't think so. His name was Louis Witt. In fact, he lives up in Argyle, Texas to this very day.
Really?
I believe he's 72 now. And he says he was the umbrella man, that he did open the umbrella. And was, he said he was jousting the president. He didn't care for President Kennedy's politics. And he was, this is what he said. Of course, some of the great researchers don't believe it was even him, but this man did come forward and testify. I don't know if it was or not. I'm like you all. And you know, Mr. and Miss Newman, so many things have been said about the Kennedy assassination. There's so many theories. I don't think we'll ever know the truth. I will ask you this: in your opinion of being where you were that day, and if you ever even studied this or not, do you believe that Lee Harvey Oswald shot the president?
Mike, I don't know. I think you could take, this is not answering your question directly, but let's say conspiracy or the act of one lone assassin. I think you could take either position real easy. Now, what's boggled my mind over the years is there's quite a few people have claimed they saw something from behind the fence. Now, my question there is, all these people lying, or are they telling the truth? I mean, you've got a handful of people that claim that, but some of these people have kind of discredited themselves over the years. You know, I'm not going to go to naming individuals.
Oh, no, that's fine.
But
I do that.
but you know, that's the thing in the back of my mind, and so. Was there connection, Oswald, with Ruby? You know, the case has been made that there is, but yes, whether that's factual or not, or made up.
I have people on tape interview that knew Jack Ruby in the '50s and knew Officer Tippit, and some who knew Oswald, and they all say that they all three knew each other. Tippit and Oswald had known each other a very short period of time, as to where Ruby and Tippit had known each other for several years. In fact, we talked to Officer Ellis about that, and he, you know, Jack Ruby knew a lot of Dallas police officers. That's just factual. Sure. A lot of people may try to deny it, but he did. He knew several Dallas police officers personally, and he would go to the police department quite a bit, and they knew him. And I had one detective told me, he said, Mike, he said, Jack came to the police department so much. He said at one time, before I really got to know him, he said, I thought he was a detective, because he knew several police officers. And many police officers have said that, even Jim Lavelle. And
well, he seemed to cater to them.
He did, and some way or another he knew him, of course. Being in the fact that he was a nightclub owner, and some people say he was in the mafia, part of the mob, which that's been controversial over the years itself, as you all know. And that's why I was saying so many things are coming. That's why I wanted to do this interview with you and Miss Newman, Mr. Newman, and because you've always told the truth about what you saw that day, as many other people, some people added to or taken away from it, if you want to go to that area. But we tried to get people of factual statements, and of course, where you were, you couldn't have been no more factual as to what you saw. And Mr. and Miss Newman, I tell you, you were a great part of history. It was a sad thing that you and other witnesses that were there had to witness. And Officer Hardis told me something a few weeks ago. He said, Mike, he said, I'm 75 now. And of course, where he was on his motorcycle just to the left of Miss Kennedy, he couldn't have been any closer on that side. And he says he still wakes up at night sometime to this very day. And he can see that date. He said he sees this festival in his dream, and something is about to happen that he knows he has no control over. He says all the time. Officer Hargis and I are very close. We've known each other 39 years this year. And I met Officer Hargis over at Bowed Story Junior High School. They had the youth action centers at that time. And he was the police officer there, and that's where I met him when I was going to junior high school in Oak Cliff, Bowed Story. And I would say after 2 weeks, 2 weeks after I met him, we talked about the Kennedy assassination. And also being in Oak Cliff, living in Oak Cliff, as you all did in earlier years, many of the police officers that were in Dealey Plaza that day patrolled Oak Cliff. And in my association with Officer Hargis and my friendship with he and Officer O.E. Stanton, I met many of these policemen that were there in Dealey Plaza that day. And I've talked to countless of them. And some of them say shots came from the book depository, and I'm talking policemen only. Some of them say shots come from the grassy knoll. Some of them say shots come from both directions. It's just something I guess we'll never know. We'll never know the whole great scenario. But I do say this, and I want to say this in front of Mr. and Ms. Newman in this interview. People that were in Dealey Plaza that day know what they saw and heard. Mr. and Ms. Newman know where they were standing. They know where they saw and heard that day. And regardless to what, it may be a person that was 5 or 6 feet away from you all that said something totally different. But the fact is, they were all there. And these researchers that have come forward with all this other, I call it hullabaloo, because some things that have been said over the years are not true. And people that were actually there that day, and certainly in the grace of still living, as Mr. and Ms. Newman are, they know what they saw and heard that day, and they tell their stories as to what they saw and heard. A lot of people try to change people's statements. You can't do that. I talked to many police officers who said they have read statements that they supposedly said that day or 2 weeks after so on and so on. J.C. White told me one time, he said, Mike, he said, I never said there was a train on the bridge, even though it's written in many. He said, I never even had such interview. But they got it written down that Officer White said a train crossed the bridge as the president was shot. And he was standing up on the bridge along with Officer J.W. Foster and Officer Earl B. Brown. There were 3 Dallas police officers on the bridge, the overpass, along with 14 railroad workers, Sam Holland being the most famous.
Mm-hmm.
And he never made such statement, but yet it's in several books. And Officer White died a few years ago, and it always bothered him. And there have been many statements written in books and things that are not true or have been made up. And I think this has been one of the flaws of all the great controversies of the Kennedy assassination, and also the fact people that have really tried to get to the truth. But 45 years later, I think it's going to stand as it is. Whether the Warren Commission, I will say myself, I don't believe the Warren Commission was totally right. And I will also say, as I've said in every interview I've done, myself personally, I believe the failed shot, or the last shot, came from the grassy knoll. I also believe the shot hit the president in the back of the head from the one. I believe 2 headshots hit him at the same time. And I believe that because of the medical evidence, the physical and photographic evidence, and the way the president's head looked in the autopsy pictures that I have seen over the years. Josiah Thompson, and he interviewed you all early in the 60s, and he, in his book, the drawings are in there, he believes the same thing, that 2 shots hit the president simultaneously, and I'll always believe that. I don't know how many shots were fired. Most people said 3, and I think you said y'all heard basically 3. Some people said 3, some said they only heard 2. Some people said they heard as many as 10 to 11 shots. So here we go again with that, over the years too, and as to how many shots were fired, and then how long the shooting were from the first shot to the last. And I think Josiah pretty much summed that up in 6 seconds in Dallas. I think it happened in about 6 seconds. But Mr. and Ms. Newman, it's been a pleasure being in your home today, and it's been a pleasure talking with you and seeing you again. And the 45th anniversary is coming up, and I'm sure if you're in good health and living, you all will probably be down there. And I think it'll probably be like the 40th. A lot of people are supposed to have some big shenanigan there again this year. I don't know, one of the groups. But sad and tragic day, and you all were certainly a great part of that. Could have been no closer. And Steve and I thank you for the interview, and
Well, thank you, Mike.
continued life and good health, and may God bless us all.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bet.
Today is September the 23rd, 2008, and I'm sitting here at the Quality Inn Hotel at the corner of I-35, Stemmons Freeway, and Walnut Hill in Dallas, Texas. And my friend, Mr. Steve Stiles, is doing this interview with us. He's doing the camera work today. And the man sitting immediately to my right, this is Officer Robert Rowe of the Dallas Police Department, retired. And Officer Rowe served the Dallas Police Department, I think, late 1955 till 1981. Is that correct?
About 1980.
1980. And Officer Rowe, he wore the badge with pride and dignity and respect and merit the way it should be, as many old officers that I know, old-time officers, that joined the force back in the 50s and early 60s. And, of course, Officer Rowe at the time, in November of 63, he was employed by the Dallas Police Department in a kind of an undercover line of work at that time. And we're interviewing him today because on that fateful Friday, November 22nd, 1963, at approximately 1:25 to 1:45 p.m. that evening, Officer Robert Rowe was present at the Texas Theater, where the suspected man, Lee Harvey Oswald, who was suspected and who has been said to have killed President Kennedy, that's where Oswald was captured and arrested by several Dallas police officers, Officer Robert Rowe being one of them. So Officer Rowe, saying that, we'll get right into the interview. Officer Rowe, when did you join the Dallas Police Department?
Well, I went to work as a civilian to begin with in the jail, and for about a year and a half or so, and then later on I took my police training and got out on the street in uniform in early 1956.
Early 1956. And just for the record, did you all have partners then, or were you by yourself, or did you have a partner?
Most of us working in the patrol division at night, in the evening hours, night hours, two-man squads. In the daytime, unless there was a rookie officer training, usually there was just one officer.
Yes, sir.
And of course, the traffic division, traffic investigators working accidents, they work by themselves.
Yes, sir. Now, during that time when you went on the street in early 1956, and you at that time were a full-fledged Dallas police officer, now, did you know Officer J.D. Tippett at that time?
Yes, sir, I did.
And I think Officer Tippett probably joined the force a few years before you had.
Maybe a couple of years,
yes,
two and a half years before.
You also knew Officer B.W. Hargis, Bobby Hargis.
Yes, sir.
Officer Hargis is a very dear friend of mine. I've known him many years. He's like family, and you and he were both on the force at the same time. Well, now, Officer Rowe, at approximately, and I don't know the exact time. I don't know if you remember the exact time, but we'll just say somewhere around 1:30 to 1:50, anywhere in those 20 minutes. You went to the Texas Theater that day, November 22nd, 1963.
Yes, sir.
And what purpose did you go to the theater for, sir, that day?
On that day, I was working undercover out of the Narcotics and Vice Division. My partner and I, Sergeant T.O. Troutman, who happens to be deceased now, we were dressed in plain clothes, beard, mustaches, long hair, and I had long hair then, ponytail. We drove into the alley after hearing on commercial radio. We didn't have a police radio at that time. In fact, the Dallas Police Department didn't have walkie-talkies in those days. And we didn't have a police car. We were driving an old pickup truck. We heard on commercial radio that they had spotted or heard that a suspect in the J.D. Tippett murder not too far from there, about 8 blocks away.
7 or 8 blocks, yes, sir.
had been cornered or went into the theater. And there was a group of squad cars out front, and some detectives were there, and a crowd of citizens gathering.
In the front of the
Uniform officers, detectives, going in the front door. We were in the alley.
Yes, sir.
There were 2 uniform officers out there. My partner and I, Sergeant, we were in plain clothes, but we knew the 2 officers in the alley, and there were about 5 or 6 civilian people out there too.
Yes, sir.
And this incident happened so quickly, there was never really a large crowd had gathered.
Out in the alley where you all were.
And there was no particularly large crowd out in front, unless you see those pictures in the journals of the front of the theater. Looks like to be maybe 15 or 20 people out there.
Yes, sir. Now, also, when you entered the back of the theater, and y'all went through the back door, you and your partner and 3 or 4 other officers.
They opened the back door. Somebody, in fact, I heard them just as they opened the door. Some sergeant or lieutenant in there said, "Open that back door. We need to get some light in here."
Yes, sir.
It was an old theater then, and it had a couple of 40-watt bulbs in there, and they needed some light in there. And so opening that back door, which is a fire escape, it's going to let some light in.
Yes, sir. Most definitely.
And that's when the officers knew us, and so we went on in. I just stepped inside the door, and my partner went on up to the lobby.
Up toward the front of the theater, or in the lobby area of the theater.
Because the theater faces sideways to us.
Yes, sir, it did.
And if he walks straight ahead, he'll go straight to the lobby.
Yes, sir. Now, Officer Rowe, when you entered the back of the theater, I do believe, you tell me if I'm wrong, Officer Maurice Nick McDonald was one of the officers that went in through the back with you.
No, he didn't go in back. He was already in the theater.
He was already in the theater.
And he was standing behind the man that was found to be Oswald later on.
Later on.
And he was sort of standing in the aisleway or standing in the row behind Oswald. And Oswald was facing the screen to what would be my left now.
Yes, sir.
And Officer McDonald was standing silently beside him. What the sergeants and lieutenants in there were doing was stationing officers behind each group, and there were 12 or 13 people in there. Now, some of them were asleep, some of them were drunk, and they were waking them up. And I heard when they opened the door, "Stand up and put your hands on your head."
That's what some officers said.
Several times.
Several times. Do you know if that particular time was this particular officer talking to Oswald, or?
The officer that was hollering the command was talking to everybody.
Okay.
And Oswald did stand up and put his left hand on his head. And when the door came open and the light went into the theater,
Yes, sir.
I saw him stand up and look toward the back door, because there weren't that many people there. And he moved over 3 or 4 seats toward the back door as if he was going to run toward us.
Toward the back of the theater. To the exit. Yes, sir. I got you.
To the side of the theater.
Side of the door. Yes, sir. Now, at that point in time, when that particular thing happened, at that very point, Nick McDonald had pretty much was, I would say, 3 or 4 feet away from Oswald at that time.
And there was a seat in between them.
Yes, sir.
A row of seats between them.
And when Officer McDonald approached Oswald, did you hear him say anything to Oswald?
Well, see, Oswald stood up the first time and moved over toward the back door, and then he sat down again.
Yes, sir.
McDonald moved over with him.
Yes, sir.
And, of course, they were about 25 feet from me.
Yes, sir.
Maybe 30 feet.
Away from you.
From me, and I was standing just inside the back door. I heard right quick after they told him to stand up again, he put his hand on his left hand on his head, and he had a loose shirt that was not tucked in, and I believe it was a long sleeve shirt.
Yes.
I can't remember that part of it. Oswald came up. I was told this later on. I couldn't see it. Oswald came up with a pistol from his belt underneath his shirt.
Yes, sir.
And Officer McDonald was over behind him.
To his left side.
And when he got the pistol up about right here, the shirt fell off the pistol, and we all heard, "He's got a gun."
That's what they said.
Loud and right quick. He's got a gun. And at the same time, Officer McDonald dove or leaned over that row of seats and grabbed that pistol with both hands. And of course, he tumbled over in the seats, old hard wooden seats, had some padding on them, had some padding on the arms, but they were made out, the arms were made out of metal, and the back were made out of wooden.
Yes, sir.
And he crumpled himself up in there with Oswald, and then in a few seconds said, "I've got it, I've got it."
See it.
So everybody more or less took it for granted he got the pistol, which he did. And in the tussle, Oswald pulled the trigger, but the hammer hit in Officer McDonald's hand somewhere. I can't tell you exactly where, but everybody figures here, or it might have been in this part, but he had 2 or 3 stitches later on and started bleeding on him and Oswald.
And of course, when that happened, that defected the gun from firing.
No, the gun did not fire.
The firing pin would not hit.
Right.
Now, at that point in time, did several officers charge?
Several of them. Most of them were plain clothes. One of them was uniform.
And you were one of them.
Officer Ray Hawkins was in uniform. And Sergeant Jerry Hill, who was big and heavy set, he hollered, "I can't get to my handcuffs. Somebody give me some handcuffs." And he was down in the pile there, grabbing and shoving. And they were all trying to get a hold of him. And there was another detective who's deceased now, Bob Carroll. And then there was an officer,
I believe Kenny Lyons was one of them.
Kenneth Lyons, and several officers.
Paul Bentley.
Hudson.
And T.A. Hudson.
T.A. Hudson. And there were, he was in uniform, and Lyons was in uniform, and then Bentley, Paul Bentley was a detective. He's the one that's seen in the photograph coming out the front door and has a cigar in his mouth.
Yes, sir.
And
who just recently passed away.
Age 80, 86, 85.
He was up in age, yeah.
And they wrote a list of officers later on, and of course naturally they left me off the list, because if you're working undercover, you're not supposed to be put on any kind of report.
Certainly.
Unless it has something to do with your undercover police business. And of course we weren't supposed to be there that day. But we just happened to drive by.
Yeah, you were in the vicinity of the suspect where it had been reported that
and that particular day, I didn't really get my hands on Oswald. Sergeant Jerry Hill said, "Give me some handcuffs," and there was a uniform officer way over there, and he was reaching this way and couldn't quite get there, so I handed the handcuffs from the officer to Sergeant Hill.
You gave the handcuffs to Sergeant Hill.
Right. I just reached about that area over there to this area over here with some handcuffs, and that's as close to history as I got.
Well,
I just happened to be there. I really didn't do it.
Pretty close. You were right.
But
right there.
I was on the scene.
Yes, sir. And you saw him you saw the officer when he handcuffed Oswald.
Right.
Now, did Oswald put up a fight? Did you ever
Well,
see him
he was struggling and everything, and of course down in between those seats and everything, there were so many officers ganged up around there.
Yes, sir.
It looked like one of these wrestling matches on television, you know. And there was some pulling and shoving and arm throwing, and he might have gotten hit by the officers, or he might have hit one of the officers. And I understood there was a story after it was over with. It's Officer McDonald said he was hit in one side of the face.
Yes, sir.
But see, Officer McDonald went headlong down in those old hard seats too, and whatever, how he was hurt might have been hitting those seats.
Could have been, yeah. It's reported that Oswald had hit him.
And Detective Bentley hurt his knee quite a bit.
Now, also, this is something I wanted to clear up for years. And of course, you being as close as you were, you couldn't have been much closer. And you certainly, as you say, you gave Officer Hill the handcuffs as he handcuffed Oswald from the other officer. So you were right there.
And that's another thing. Sergeant Jerry Hill, we've been friends for years. In fact, he was working in the personnel section when I was hired back in 1955.
Yes, sir.
And I'd known him down through the years, but that particular day, he doesn't remember me handing him the handcuffs. And of course, the way I was dressed that day, I hadn't seen him in about a year or two.
Yes, sir.
And of course, my name was not on any reports. And I've talked to several of those officers that are still living, and the ones that are passed on, and nobody remembers me being there. Well, if I'm not there, I'm not going to get reported doing anything wrong, am I?
Well, I tell you, I have spoke with Officer Tommy Hudson. I spoke with Bob Carroll before he passed away, and Kenny Lyons. Another officer that was there at that time was Hal Summers.
Yeah.
And they all confirmed that you definitely were there, but you were working undercover. And of course, they knew that being police officers. But they all told me that you were right there at the scene when Oswald was arrested.
Close.
Close enough. Now, this is something I want to clear up, Officer Rowe, today, and I know being where you were, you can clear this up for me. There's been a report that's been stated many years, I don't know if there's any truth to it or not, that as Oswald was being arrested and as they were trying to get the handcuffs on him, is what you were talking about just a few moments ago, did you ever see any police officer hit Oswald in the back of the head with the butt of a shotgun? Did you ever see that?
I never did.
You never saw that?
No.
Yeah.
Now, after they turned him and stood him up in those rows of seats,
yes, sir.
they took him out the other end to an aisleway.
Yes, sir.
Then they took him straight to the lobby, and then I lost
That's when you
sight
lost
of
him.
him.
Yes. No,
Now,
this was reported, so what you just said is
from the very instant that the police knew or thought he was in the theater till the first officers got there in the front, till they got him out, handcuffed and gone down to the car, no more than 15 to 18 minutes went by.
that's about how
It
long
was all snap, 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 go.
Yeah. And
It was quick.
I certainly know that's true because I've always said 18 to 20 minutes. Yes, sir.
And like I said a while ago, there were there were one or two or several news reporters there, newspaper reporters, magazine reporters or something, but no one had a camera. All the pictures you see coming out of the lobby, old dark lobby, and coming out into the sunlight out front were all made by amateurs and sold and copyrighted for later publication. There were no pictures made in the back. There were no pictures made inside the theater except when they just came out of the lobby. You can see them coming into the sunlight.
That's very true, sir, and I've seen those photographs, and what you said is just as true can be. Also, let me ask you a question, and this is the last thing we'll talk about the arrest. This is another thing that has been said. I think you and I have discussed this before, and I've discussed it with many other police officers and researchers. There was a report, or there's been statements made, supposedly, I don't know if this happened or not. I wasn't there. You may be able to shed some light on it for me now. Did you at any time, knowing Jack Ruby, did you see Jack Ruby anywhere in the Texas theater at the time Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested?
No, sir.
You did not see him?
Never.
Do you recall another arrest other than Oswald's arrest?
My partner and I left out the door as soon as they got the handcuffs on him, and I saw him take him to the front. When my partner came on by, he said, let's go, let's get out of here.
And y'all went back out the same door?
We went out the back door
that you came in. And so
after we went out, there's one of the officers on the outside secured that back door.
Yes, sir.
And then they started taking charge of the other people that were in there to get statements. And I understand they found 4 or 5 kids that had skipped school,
Yes, sir.
that sneaked in.
Yes, sir.
They climbed over a plywood board and were hiding up in the balcony.
Balcony area. Yeah. Well, I know one man that was there. He is now a local radio personality here in Dallas, and his name was Mr. Davis, and he confirmed everything you just told me because he saw the whole thing. Everything that you just said, Mr. Davis has told me for years that it happened just that way.
Happened real quick.
Yes, sir.
And incidental.
Now,
with safety to all the officers, especially McDonald.
Now, Officer Rowe, you knew Jack Ruby several years before all of this happened.
I knew him very well.
And it has been reported that Jack Ruby, of course, and I know you know this, that it's said that Jack Ruby was part of the underworld, organized crime, the mafia, whatever term you may want to use. In your opinion, and in your years as a police officer and experience as a police officer, and in knowing Jack Ruby, what would be your opinion of Jack Ruby? What kind of man was it in your
Well, we always figured, and it was substantiated many, many times, that he was connected with the mafia.
Yes, sir.
In his early days, he's Jewish boy, grew up in Chicago.
Yes, sir.
Name was Rubenstein.
Yes, sir.
He dropped the steam when he came to Dallas to be playing Jack Ruby. He was in the nightclub business, and in his early days in Dallas, he also was listed with our department as a bookmaker or a mob fix-it man.
Yes, sir.
And a lot of the officers knew him because a lot of the officers worked and patrolled his nightclubs.
Yes, sir.
And he had strip clubs in the downtown area way back in the years when there weren't as many strip clubs as they are. There were only 3 or 4 downtown Dallas.
Yes, sir.
And of course, they were strictly regulated in those days with the liquor laws.
Yes, sir.
And Jack would get acquainted with officers, and of course, the statute of limitations have run out on me for years, but Jack Ruby made several car payments for me.
Yes, sir.
He even handed me $100 bills sometime and told me to be sure and pay my rent.
I've always heard that from several officers.
And we worked the downtown Carousel Club, and he also had a club at the time of the assassination. He had another club out on Oak Lawn, in the Oak Lawn area,
Yes, sir.
called the Vegas Club.
Johnny Vegas Club.
And it wasn't, neither one of them were very big clubs. Neither one of them would hold 100 people.
Yes, sir.
You know, less than 100 people seating or standing. But he was connected, and there are several mob members living in and around Dallas at the time where we had photographs and phone messages and various things, how they were keeping in contact with each other.
In your opinion, Officer Rowan, of course, being on the force at that time in the mid-50s up to 1981, and knowing Jack Ruby, would you say that Jack Ruby knew several Dallas police officers?
Oh, many, many. He knew uniform officers. He knew command officers, and he would come in. He had an open door. He operated with the power of an officer,
Yes, sir.
and he was even known to carry a pistol all the time.
Yes, sir. I've
And
always
he
heard
used to
that.
carry brass knucks all the time.
Heard that several
And
times.
a lot of people around the city hall, the civilians and everything, because we all wore hats in those days.
I see you have one of your hats that you wore
This
back
is an
then.
old hat I've had for 50 years
Yes, sir.
that one of the old assistant chiefs gave me. And we would always go covered when we were talking to the public or answering calls in plain clothes in those days.
Yes, sir.
And of course, uniform officers had caps.
Yes, sir.
They always wore their caps, but nowadays the police officers don't wear caps. They don't wear hats.
You don't
The
see
style and culture has changed since then.
It has.
But Jack Ruby wore a little snap brim hat all the time, and a lot of civilians around the police department thought he was a police officer.
Yes, sir.
And he'd walk right in the dispatcher's office. He'd go in any area. Of course, in those days we didn't have master locks at the doors. Everything was sort of an open door policy in those days.
Yes, sir.
And of course, we had certain procedures of security where we checked people out coming in and out, but no one checked Bob Jack Irby. And all the older officers would punch the new men and tell them who Jack Ruby was.
So that they would know who he
Don't
was.
bother him. He's okay.
Yes, sir.
And Jack would come in, and the day Oswald was shot, I was told many, many times that he was carrying fat envelopes. And a fat envelope, if you don't know or the viewers don't know, that's an envelope the size of a $100 bill. And you can put as many $100 bills in there as you want to, or you can put as many $50 bills in there, or $5 bills you want to. He was carrying about 7 fat envelopes the day he killed Oswald that he had not delivered yet. And he may have already delivered some that day to officers in the police department.
Yes, sir.
And he used to mark down the number on the envelope like 12, 26, 2, and that would be the officer or person, deputy chief, lieutenant, or sergeant that was taking the fat envelope
Also,
to pay his rent with
also,
or
Roland,
to pay his car with.
when Ruby shot Oswald, in your opinion and to your knowledge of what you know yourself or you were told by fellow officers, do you believe Oswald or that Jack Ruby went down the ramp or that he came into another part of the building?
There's really no telling, since he had in most cases he knew all the patrol officers guarding all the entrances,
Certainly.
and he could have been in there for an hour or only 30 minutes. And of course there are a lot of accounts of people saying they saw him get out of a car and he was driving a car. I never did know Jack Ruby to even have a driver's license, and he had several cars, but he'd always have somebody else driving him.
Yes, sir. He did have 2 cars, I know that I found out. But you're right.
Because we used to take him home all the time, and he had several apartments all the time. He'd have apartments for his girlfriends, and he'd go over there sometime, and he'd go home. We used to take him home in the squad car, the marked police car, all the time, just like it was a cab.
Yes, sir.
He'd call us. He'd call us at home, and we'd go get him at the apartment and take him to the club.
Also, Roland, let me ask you another question. In your opinion as a police officer, and I certainly value that because you had many, many years' experience in dealing with the public and dealing with the crimes. In your opinion, sir, do you believe that Oswald shot President Kennedy? Do you believe Oswald fired any shots that day, in your opinion?
Well, to all of what I've learned, I believe that he may more than likely fired the first shot.
The first shot.
Because they put him in that window up there and they made certain he had a job in that building to put him on the scene.
Somebody.
And he bought that rifle on a mail order terms, and he was put in there as a patsy to get caught. And it not necessarily was in the plan for Ruby to take care of him, but it worked out that way where they did have somebody to take him out.
Yes, sir.
So, but Oswald probably was thinking that he was the only one.
Yes, sir.
But in my opinion, there was 2 or more shooting.
2 or more gunmen at the time President Kennedy was killed.
2 or more.
Yes, sir. I share that opinion deeply with you, sir.
Because he had an old Italian rifle that was bolt action,
Yes, sir.
single load. In order to, if he already had one in, fired that first shot, then he had to open that bolt, and he had to put another one in to get those other 2 shots off.
Yes, sir.
And that takes a lot of time, and that car is moving.
Yes, sir.
That car is moving. And the time element didn't
Didn't match up.
match up
No, it sure did.
to me.
Now, Officer Rowe, do you believe that that Oswald, Lee Harvey Oswald, shot Officer J.D. Tippett?
The pistol they caught him with that he pulled, and Officer McDonald grabbed the ballistic shot. The ballistics test showed that the bullets, I think he shot Officer Tippett 4 times.
Yes, sir. He was shot 4 times.
3 or 4 times. And one of them that was found, the ballistics test went to the pistol.
That Oswald had at the time of his arrest.
And also with the old silver nitrate paraffin test on your hand, his right hand was shown to have fired a weapon recently. Now that could have been from the pistol or the rifle. However, the rifle showed, I don't know whether they did any testing on him or not.
Yes, they did. And none was
On
found
silver
on the
nitrate.
rifle, yeah.
But if you're using a rifle, the test is the silver nitrate filter has to be done on the side of the face because you've got it up here also,
Yeah.
and the hand.
Yeah, that test was done on Oswald, according to several great researchers in the case.
But back then it wasn't too good, and still that's not going to tell you when it was fired.
Certainly.
Just recently,
Just recently.
in the past.
Also, Rowe, in your years in Dallas, and we're going to wrap this up here pretty quick, but in your years in Dallas, sir, just say just before the assassination, during the assassination, right after, and then up till now, in your years in Dallas, do you think that the city of Dallas and the state of Texas has been just overmarred by this, and if so, what is your opinion as to what it done to the city of Dallas after the assassination?
As time goes by, this being coming up being the 45th year, there are a lot of people that are not here anymore.
Yes, sir.
Thousands and thousands of people are not here anymore. But the ones that have heard the stories about it, there are a lot of different opinions as to who might have been involved and who did it and everything. And there are a lot of conspiracy theories. But it still remains to be a center of interest downtown.
Certainly.
All year long.
Every day.
Because we have a 6th-floor museum in that very depository building that it retains the interest and keeps the interest in Dallas.
Yes,
and it was a historical factor, and there's something I wanted to remind you that maybe you've forgotten to ask me, but when I was watching television, when Jack Ruby stepped up there in the basement to kill Oswald,
I was going
to
ask you
fire that one shot, It was very noisy. Now, they had some television cameras there, and back then they weigh 150 pounds, and they were on big wheels this big around. And they did have some cameras and some microphones in there that day. And there were a lot of noise. And Jack Ruby climbed over that little barricade there in the parking lot, and he stepped up there and fired one shot. And there was a sharp moment of silence right after the shot. And a detective right over there in that area with his back up against the brick wall, Billy Combest, hollered, "Jack, you son of a bitch."
That's what he hollered.
And everybody could hear it on television, and it came out plain. And back in those days, son of a bitch was one of the bad words.
Yes, sir.
But now, if you ever hear the main live broadcast, you'll hear Billy Combest say, "Jack, you son of a bitch," in that moment of silence.
Yes, sir.
And I know Combest, he said it, but a lot of people, including the detectives, were right there close, thought it was outlaw that said, "Jack, you son of a bitch."
Yes, sir. Well, I did. I have, like I said, one time, two occasions, met Billy Combest, and he certainly was standing right behind LaBelle. And what you just said, he did confirm, and I know that is very true. And he certainly was right there, as officer. Another good friend of mine I've known many years, Roy Lowry, who was on the Dallas Police Department at the time. You see him in the photograph. Of course, Officer Graves and Officer Montgomery, they were all right there when Ruby shot Oswald. There's some, Officer Rowe, there's been many things about the assassination, the shooting of Officer Tippett, the shooting of Oswald, the death of Jack Ruby when he died. And in my opinion, in researching this, and of course being in Dealey Plaza as a young kid that day myself, and when you're a kid, I wouldn't say too up to apt on the politics of the world at that time, but we went down to see the president that morning, as everybody else did, and that's the only reason we were there. But as the years went by, say from the time I was 16 till now, I've researched the Kennedy assassination, talked to many witnesses who were there, some who are still living like yourself, talked to many police officers and got their opinions of it, FBI agents, Secret Service agents. I've talked to several. It seems that as you said a while ago, the interest is certainly still there to this very day. People come to Dealey Plaza. People go to the 6th floor museum where shots were fired from. And the 6th floor museum, of course, entertains a lot of people about the assassination every year. You had the Conspiracy Museum, which is no longer there, but it was there for several years. Down in Dealey Plaza, you have several guys who sell the little JFK programs or journals. Mr. Robert Groton, certainly one of the two great researchers in the case, along with Mr. Josiah Thompson. Robert goes down on the weekend, sells his books, The Killing of a President, High Treason, The Search for Lee Harvey Oswald. But to me, Officer Rowe, it seems that for some reason, people have tried to distort several things that is true. I don't believe that everything the Warren Commission said was true, but at the same time, I believe many things that the Warren Commission said was true. I don't think that some things were done on purpose. I think there were some mistakes made in the Warren Commission investigation. Another thing that has been said over the years that has truly upset me, and I won't say this with you sitting here by my side, people have said over the years, and I know you've heard this, Officer Hargis and I have talked about it many times, Officer O.E. Stanton, Officer Dave Pye, Nolan Perry, I've talked about, that the Dallas Police Department was involved in the assassination of John Kennedy, and that really, it just pisses me off. I'm going to use those words, because that's exactly what it does. Well, you officers that I knew, and I know y'all didn't have a damn thing to do with this assassinating President Kennedy.
I've heard that a lot too, down through the years, and that's something that I disbelieve.
Yes,
that any
I agree. Now,
officer would have anything to do with killing the president.
And this is me saying there's not Officer Rowe. I'm saying it's Michael Brownlow. I'm the one interviewing Officer Rowe here today. I want to go on this interview and say this in the presence of someone who was part of the city at the time. I do believe there was one man who was a member of the Dallas Police Department that had prior knowledge to the assassination. I'll always believe that, and I think he had that knowledge because of Jack Ruby. And I think Jack Ruby had told him. I don't know if he could have stopped it or not, or if he was threatened, which I'm sure he probably was afterwards. But he was high in the Dallas Police Department, and I'm not talking about Chief Jesse Carey, but someone very close to him. I'm not going to call any names at this point in time. But I do believe that there was one person who was a member of the Dallas Police Department, one and one only, that had some prior knowledge to the assassination. And like I said, I don't think really. I really feel like if